On behalf of CI, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the final community conversation for 2021, as presented by the Community Association Institute of South Africa. Today, we've really got the A team of South Africa here, Magnus, Heystek, and Mike Schüssler. Magnus is the founder of Brenthurst Wealth. He's been around for a while, right? He's the author of many books on investments, and he's also owns various properties throughout South Africa and in Mauritius. Also on the panel is Mike Schüssler. Mike is also a consultant to Brenthurst Wealth, but he's probably the most quoted economist out there when it comes to anything in South Africa. He's real in the A team. For those of you who follow both the gentlemen on Twitter, you'll see they're quite active now with the load shedding and all the investments. So to Mike and to Magnus, thank you very much. It's really a privilege to have you two guys here today. Just on behalf of CAISA, I just want to read a quick disclaimer. We are the Community Association Institute, a non-profit company. We are voting members. We are regulated by an MOI and the Companies Act. The panel and the participants does not necessarily endorse the views of CAISA, and all the publications used is protected by the intellectual property rights of CAISA and cannot be used unless there's written consent by the Community Association Institute. Right, thanks guys. We're going to talk about property investment, especially in the States. But Magnus, I want to hear from you and Mike internationally. Give us an idea of property investment. How's it been doing over the last, say, 20 years worldwide, and then get an idea of what's happening or how it was the investment in South Africa, and also the impact of 2008. And are we out of the woods yet after the financial meltdown in 2008? Thank you. Magnus?
Yes, I think, Johan, yes, first of all, Johan, nice talking to you. We've had many, many rounds of golf at Dainfern and at Beaconwood and other courses and squash courts and so on. So we do go back a while, and yes, I have enjoyed living in Beaconwood as I do in Dainfern. And I also have properties down in the Cape, Valdevie, Paul Valley. So I know the state living, and I think it's a very desirable way to live in South Africa. But to answer your question, if you ask me that question about property investment in South Africa generally, and you look back at the last 20 years, you have to break it up into two parts. From 2001 onwards to 2008, property was in a major bull market, and property prices, depending on which statistics you look at, were growing far quicker than the inflation rate. The economy was growing, jobs were created, optimism was high, and there was a lot of property finance available in the market, and there was intense competition between the banks. You might recall the day when the bank called you to say, Johan, don't you want another loan? Now you have to stand on your knees to get the same loan, which is quite ironic. So it was a perfect storm in many instances, and a lot of people were sucked into buying property which they perhaps could not really afford. They didn't understand the longer term implications. And when all that came to a shuddering halt in 2008, that marked the top of the property market in South Africa, and also the middle of that cycle that we're talking about. Around about that time, there were many economists warning that people are overpaying for property, they're not doing their homework, and this fear of losing out was also abused by a lot of property developers who preyed on that and pushed up prices way beyond the relative or the underlying value of the property. People who bought late in that cycle are paying the price today, because the last or the subsequent 10-year period has not been great. And I think Mike will refer to some statistics, but I saw some stats this week talking about property prices in real terms in South Africa. I'm talking residential now all the time, was -2%. over a period of time. So if you include all the costs involved in property ownership, you probably have not made money, or you haven't grown your wealth over the last 10 years. You bought 20 years ago, maybe a different story. So it's a story of two halves. You made a lot of money going up to 2008, 2009, and you possibly gave back some of those profits going back. But to answer your question, we're talking about property in general, but if you focus on estates, I think estates have done far better than the average, and for a number of reasons. First of all, scarcity, safety and security. As the crime rate in South Africa escalated, people more and more moved into estates, and as the infrastructure crumbled around the estates.
Only
I'll need to try.
We will mute that now. Sorry, Magnus, you can continue. So you're on mute, Magnus. Magnus, you're on mute.
There we go. My apologies. What I was saying is that if you separate the estates in South Africa and you do individual analysis, you'll also find regional differences. I think that the estates in the Western Cape and the Southern Cape have done better. And I'm aware of how well the Western Cape has done, perhaps better than estates in the northern parts of the country. But within those regions, the estates have done relatively better than the surrounding areas, the suburbia, the traditional suburbia. So to answer your question in a very long-winded way, estate living is still, in my view, very, very desirable. In many cases, preferable if you can afford it to living in suburbs. And I think the crime rate plays a major role. And also now what we're seeing in terms of infrastructure, which is provided by municipalities or not provided by municipalities. People are saying, I cannot rely, I would move into an estate where at least I have a greater degree of autonomy and control over those basic provisions, water, sanitation, etc. It comes with other issues, but I think estate living, estate investment, if you take it over a 20-year period of time, has done well. Over a 10-year period, because you bought at the peak 10 years ago, perhaps not so well, but I think property values will do better in estates than the traditional open street suburb in South Africa, and again, for a variety of reasons.
Okay, Magnus, and I'm going to get back to you because there's some more detailed questions I want to ask about, estate living and the amenities and what goes with that. I want to give Mike a chance, if he's got some stats, because I know that's his forte, in terms of property investments internationally, how's it done, or how's it been like over the last 10 or 20 years? Mike, you're on mute.
I took the stats back 50 years even, just before the program, and I was surprised to find out that in Greece, you had a 34% decline in real terms of property. Wow. So, and then you have a Japan that's gone through a major issue. I think it was end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s, and they had a 0.2% increase in total. And the best increase was the UK over 50 years, and that was 450%. But, that still indicates that over those 50 years, you've only done, or you've done quite well, but you probably got to about 10%, 9% above inflation. But that's probably a few years. And then, so now if we look now over the last 10 years, Greece is still down. Italy, Cyprus, Russia, Spain are all down in sort of double digits. South Africa itself is down 1.5%. Now, that I think tells you where we were. If we look over 50 years, the South Africa was up 39%. So that's less than 1% a year over the rate of inflation. It is a return. And it says to me that over a long period of time, South Africa has a history of increasing prices. Now when we've had these price knocks, it should be a good time to buy, but South Africa's got a particular problem, and we'll get to that just now. Then on the other side of this, over all these sort of time periods, I saw a country where we flee to called New Zealand. And New Zealand's done 100%. Now, Mauritius isn't here. It's probably just too small to as a country to be on the list. It's got 40, 50 countries here. But it is interesting that I think, New Zealand stands out, the only country that's increased with 100%. All the rest are, the next best is Chile at 84% over 10 years. And I'd say that probably the median country's done about, Thailand's done 30%, some of them, United Kingdom 27%, Turkey 17%. I'm just using some. So I think the typical thing that one can look for maybe in a country that's growing is that the growth rate of the economy is probably expressed, or the GDP per capita is expressed in the home prices. I think, Greece doing so badly is because they had a crisis. South Africa is in a crisis. So I think the property values line up far more with the GDP per capita than would stock markets, because stock markets are a very different animal. You've got companies that can cut the costs, they can invest in other countries. It's not just in one country, whereas a property, you can't move it. So in my opinion, if I look at it, if we didn't have the rights, we didn't have this low growth in the last 10 years, I would say property in South Africa would be a reasonable investment. I do not think, however, it is a reasonable investment unless you've got a view that South Africa is going to grow tremendously. Then it becomes an idea for me, when do you buy a property? Well, I think there's nothing wrong with owning a property that you live in yourself, or maybe one or two others that you invest in. But I think most of us are property heavy in South Africa. 62% of South Africans owned their own house a while ago, and it's become a bit less. It's about 50 something now. But the point is, the majority of South Africans own a property. We are a property owning nation. Only about 20 or 30% of us rent. There are people that live for free in RDP houses, and they might not be transferred. But I think you're right as well. What Magnus said is that because of our high crime rate and so on, and the people that perform well in a shrinking economy or a barely growing economy will be moving to estates and will be moving to that sort of lifestyle. However, at the other side, the sort of flats, if I look at the Stats SA stuff, the rentals of flats are now actually negative. They're declining. And whereas townhouses, which is probably closer to what an estate is doing okay, not okay, about 1% up, and a similar percentage up as houses. But as you can hear now, this is over the last year, a 1% doesn't, really make it worthwhile for an investment. You'll probably get more investments in stock market returns. You can, if you keep obviously a bond from the government, you buy it at the post office, say, for example, so you keep it till the end of its time, you're going to get 8% a year or 9% a year, I think, Magnus. And you take inflation away, inflation will now go up, I think, to around 6, even 7%, but you're still going to get above that. Then you can buy a bond that at the Magnus or wherever, but just a government bond that gives you permanently above inflation. So I don't always like them, but that's one way. The stock market certainly. So as an investment outside of your own living peace of mind, your place, because then you can control your own destiny a bit better, especially when you've paid it off a bit, I think is worthwhile. I really do. But I think when people go overboard and they buy too much, you link to an area You could have rights like what happened in KwaZulu-Natal. Right now, I think there's a few people there that are very worried about their property investments. So you're linked to that area. You can't move it. It makes it very, very difficult. The property managers, that's a different story, but still, if you're buying South African property, you're not moving from South Africa on that property. And they also are therefore limited to to a sense of the GDP per capita income. Even in declining populations like Germany, property has not necessarily fared that badly. That's just one aspect. Not that well either, but it has its pros and cons, I guess. But as part of your own life, to make property yours is a good idea. To take it further than that, you need to really sit down and think. You can either become a punter as well, I guess, but I don't think there's much value in countries' property that have a terrible growth scenario ahead of them. And that, I think, is the case for South Africa. I think if I look at little things like Israel's been growing quite well, so they've got a 47% increase in real terms. Chile, Estonia, doing well. I'm not sure about Luxembourg here. But I wouldn't buy a property right now in Hong Kong because we know things are changing. But they've had a 10-year 60% increase, 66% increase. So I think you've got to take that sort of view.
You will see our requirements in terms of documentation.
So thanks. You can continue, Mike.
I just think you've got to link it to that growth. And I would agree with Magnus and so on that you need to know that the property is well run, or the estate. Estates are probably a very good investment, especially if you live in them yourself. I don't know how they rent out, and I don't know if there are any figures of how rentals are doing in estates, because all I have is houses, townhouses, and flats. But I would say, I would think that would also probably be better, because even people that haven't yet bought a property would be looking at townhouses or estates. The other thing is, I'll leave it there. I would say I agree with Magnus's comment about the banks phoning you to take loans, and now it's the other way around. That's it.
Thanks, Mike, and thanks, Magnus. I asked a question before we started in terms of how long people normally keep a property before they sell it, generally. If that's maybe something both you and Magnus just want to mention something, because it's also got an impact on how long you keep the property before you either upgrade or downgrade. Do you have any stats on that?
In one of my books, and Mike is the stats king, I'll probably disprove what I'm saying, but in one of my books, which I wrote a while ago, the stat was something around about 8 years, that on average people keep a house only for 8 years before they sell it and move on. And that's something I would imagine, and I'm going back in time now, younger people tend to sell homes more often than, let's say, middle-aged people from 35 to 55. And then again, older people also tend to sell their property more often. They sell the big place, they downscale to the coast, then they move back home, and then they go into a retirement village, and then a frail care. So I think the mobility depends on stage of life. I think when people are settled in an estate with the kids at school, they will not move around as often as people do. But I think the number is about 8 years, maybe 9 years, that people hang on before they sell.
I saw it at the estate that I live at, Magnus. People would buy, then young, and then the kids go to school, then suddenly the weekends they can't play golf anymore, they sell, they move closer to schools, then later on they move back, or when they move out to the estate when they're a bit older, when they get really to retirement and they need frail care, they move back to those kind of facilities. But the 8 years is quite interesting. There was an article published, I picked it up on LinkedIn this morning, about which estates are doing fairly well. And the author of the article mentioned that there's a move away from, in his view, from houses to more apartments, you know, and sort of clusters within estates. Have you got any experience? Have you picked up anything in terms of this move away from, you know, bigger houses to clusters or to apartments? Typically, you know, naming a staying city, you know, where they more go into the apartments. Anything that you've picked up?
You know, Johan, you know, my wife will tell you that I've been a long believer, and I always joke, I buy the smallest house in the biggest estate next door to the guy with the biggest house, just to irritate them, because that's where the best returns are. And I've done it in Beaconwood, as you well know, a long-time investor there, Dane Fern, and also down Val de Vie in the Cape. You know, you've got some monsters that people have spent 50, 60, even 100 million rand on a property, which I find a most incredibly stupid investment. It's the worst allocation of capital you can think of, to put so much money in one structure, in one estate. But be that as it may, they might have that kind of money and they don't care. I went and bought the smallest properties on Val de Vie, 1 and 2 bedroom units, which came onto the market, and I've had fantastic returns. And over the last 5 years, when everything was flat or going down, my returns have been 50 to 60%, because there's a massive swing away from these big properties, and people, their pensions are not what they thought it was going to be. The cost of maintaining that big house, electricity rates and taxes, but yet people still want to live on an estate with the security and all the facilities. So my best advice to people listening to this, the smallest house in the best estate that you can afford, that's where you will find a good rental market. And, you know, my units that I own in Val de Vie, I own a couple of them, I get found every day. When do you want to sell? Do you want to sell? Do you want to sell? And I say, no. You know, why sell and what am I going to do with the money? Because right now I'm doing very well. But the guy with the 20 million and the 30 million rand property will probably be like Brenthurst and have to cut his prices from 20 to 15 to 10 to sell. So we're sitting with, and as Mike mentioned, we asset rich, and we've got too much in bricks and mortar, and sometimes in the wrong places in South Africa, which you cannot turn into cash. So the answer is small, and smaller.
Thank you. The one thing I want to ask both of you is are there any research out there, any stats of the impact that a estate has on the immediate vicinity or on the immediate neighborhood? Let's take a fan court, you know, with everything that you get at a fan court or a staying city, the impact on the immediate vicinity or the surroundings. Do we have any stats or any information available on that?
I don't, but I will say that I don't think something like George Airport would be, you know, quite as well attended to, because Fan Court has its own little thing there, and there's always, you know, a few people in there. So, you know, they probably made an impact in every sense, and they brought in people from the outside who then told people about it, and maybe other estates. I know that there's a few others near Harold's Bay and those that have opened up, even with hotels as well. And I think that made a big impact on that area. I think on the retail side, if I'm not talking estates now, but if you look at those sort of flat townhouse things, then in my area, they're building one now. And I think the shops are, you know, wringing their hands, because now all of a sudden you've got, I don't know, 50, 60, well, it's 22, no, it's about 200 extra families moving in there, you know, and if you're the owner of the spa and the supermarket or whatever, it makes a difference. I just want to say something on stats. I've got a thing from 1994 to now. The first move was to smaller dwelling houses in the construction industry. If you look, there was very few of them in the early 90s being built. less than flats and townhouses and bigger houses. Then they took over and they ran that whole decade till the mid-2000, 2006, 2007. They were still up in 2008 on the top, but flats and townhouses had caught up. And bigger houses were built as well, but they've come down and they've stayed down. There's about, on a monthly average, about 600 big houses. But now the smaller houses are even less. And that's been a trend since about 2017. So the houses smaller than 80 square meters have been built in the same as bigger houses. And what's taken over everything here in a big way, not quite the same number as we saw in the late 80s, early 2000s with the small houses, but is flats and townhouses. And the latest number on them is for the year is about 1,500. So if you're comparing 1,500 to about 500 and 500, it says to you at the moment, the move is definitely clearly, wouldn't say estates, but clearly into the townhouse sort of living style. And it has been for 3 or 4 years, although they were for a while neck and neck here in 2008 to 2010 with the with the smaller houses, but clearly the trend has been to more smaller houses being built at first, and then around 2008 everybody was more or less equal for some other reason, and then from there on the smaller townhouses fell, flats and townhouses, everything fell in 2008 obviously. And now, the last 3, 4, 5 years, you're seeing a pickup in the flats and townhouses. So that tells me that the market has moved that way, at least in the new building material stuff. On how long people stay in houses, there was some interesting research. The people that don't buy their house, whether those people that get an RDP house or a house given to them, they don't take a bank loan out on surveys. Those people, because they probably would be buying down because they don't have the income where their parents were or whatever the case may be, they keep their houses for a long time. I would say decades. When you're looking at houses being bought in South Africa, the turnover of houses is probably less than 10% a year, about 5% a year, I'd say. So, but if you look at the housing market of people who bought their own houses, there's a clear difference. So those people are normally more mobile. They have a job, an income, they're going up in the world. That's why the bank lent them money in the first place. And it's not just houses now, it's obviously all property in terms of residential. And that's just an interesting observation to make. So the fact is you might find in a neighborhood, or even later on in this state, that some people just never move. And the reason for that is that they're now not earning what they earned before. They may have lost a job and got another job but lower paying, or they got the property from their parents and they're just not as motivated and they want to stay there and that type of stuff. And obviously the houses in the RDP communities and in that just don't sell. They rent it out very often, because we found in quite a few cases that families sometimes have more than one RDP house. There's an RDP house for the mum and an RDP house for the father. But yeah, I'll leave it there. But I'd just say that it's son. So I think when, not correcting Magnus at all, I think 8 years is probably the time period that people pay it off, or less than 10 years. And that's probably by the time they then get to move. And I think that's the one thing I think that we've just got to keep in mind. So when we're talking of houses, we're not necessarily always talking of all houses.
Yes. Thanks, Mike.
Johan?
Magnus, yeah.
Sorry,
yes.
there's a question from Tu.
Yeah.
What are the major short-term threats to the property market?
I'm going to, I see Mike is laughing. I'm going to ask him to answer it towards the end. I want to put Magnus a little bit on the spot here, seeing that he's got quite a wide variety of property at different types of estates. What sort of the boxes that you tick, Magnus, when you go and invest in an estate? And I mean, if I look at your portfolio from Harties to Gauteng, I think you were resident number 5 at Dainfern. Now you're down in the Western Cape, and you also own property in Mauritius. So what sort of the things that you look at when you invest into an estate?
You know, it's there are many factors when one makes that call. You know, I need to correct you. I was number 1 in Dainfern. I was the first resident in Dainfern. So don't take that away from me.
I won't. Okay, my apologies.
And it was just, you know, in fact, why I bought in Dainfern, I was chatting to a property economist called Neville Berkowitz. And I was interviewing him, and I said to him, "You're the guy who does all the research. Where would you buy if you had to buy as a young investor stroke property owner?" And he drew me a map, and he said that triangle between the M1 North to Pretoria and Main Road going to Bryanston and slap bang was you know, Dainfern, the Four Ways area. He said that will be a major growth area. So you need to look at future growth. Which way is a city moving? And it's always moving in parts to improving in one part, whereas the other part of the city is busy decaying. It's quite strange. It's the same in Joburg, the same in Pretoria and Cape Town even. So you have to have lots of local knowledge in which direction is that city moving. Then you look at things like, is the city growing or shrinking? And then you look at availability of land, you look at highways, you look at proximity to shopping centers and things like airports. And there's a whole tick box of things that you look at. And lastly, the final one, and I still say today, and my wife is watching this and listening to this, I always say, if I make a mistake, I must be prepared to live in that house if I have bought it. And if that doesn't tick the box, I don't do it. And that kind of has worked for me. You know, I did very well at Dainfern in the early days, moved on to Steenberg when people in the Cape were very cynical about building this golfing estate next to the jail at Paulsmoor. They said it'll never work. And Steenberg has been a phenomenal success story. And the same with, you know, like Erenvale and now lately Val de Vie. If you go back, Val de Vie 15 years ago was a barren piece of land. Now that has changed the dynamics of the Paul, whereas the Paul was growing to the north, now it's growing to the south towards Franschhoek. And now you've got all the developers in there because that's where everything is happening. So there's a very interesting dynamic between where they locate a well-run estate and a dominant one. It changes the course of the developments, and now everybody is building. And we've seen it in Mount Edgecombe, we've seen it in Erenvale, Steenberg, Dainfern, and Silver Lakes is another classic example. Way out of town, and people built it. They took the chance and look at not only, you know, the development itself, but the other development that followed. I mean, it's just a major catalyst for growth in a particular area. If they had built Silver Lakes perhaps towards, let's say, the west of Pretoria, I don't think that would have worked. It simply wouldn't have worked. You need to have to take all those things into consideration. So there's a lot of things, future growth, young people coming in, very important. If the young people are not coming into an area like, and I'll give you two very classic examples. Kimberley and Bloemfontein are two cities where the children are leaving. They're leaving all the time, going to the bigger areas, and it would be extremely risky to build a successful estate when the young people, the people who are going to get married and have kids who want to settle down, are not there. They're going to the bigger towns. So that, I hope, answers your question.
Thank you. And to put you further on the spot, seeing that you spend a lot of your time, as you mentioned, up to 10 years ago on golf courses. Golf courses as a development, or golf courses as attraction, and maybe extend it a little bit to amenities. golf course designers, ranking of golf courses, those kind of things, and I'm talking about estates, do you think it's got an impact?
You know, it used to be, and I think the emphasis became too much on the golf course. You know, every estate was trying to be the #1 golf course in the country, making it more and more difficult for the ordinary members. And in my circle of friends, a lot of ordinary members said, I don't want to play on the #1 course in the country. I want to play on an enjoyable course. And that's what I liked about Beaconwood. You could play off the back tees, but it was a very enjoyable golf course. A lot of
Magnus?
The picture is frozen. Maybe there's a problem.
Yeah.
I would just like to say, you know, I'm with Magnus, but I don't play golf.
Yes.
So I don't want to be on a golf course. You know, and I think that's one area I think that one could look at. I know you're a community of property investors, but I think if one can get other things going, I know in Irene there's a sort of horse or estate or equestrian estate, and there's a farm estate. And I wonder if there isn't a gap in the market, and that's just my thinking. I don't know much about estate planning and living, and I just think there's something missing. You know, if you could have something that has a bit of a clubhouse, maybe has a tennis court, has a gym, walking paths, then you don't have that expensive upkeep of a golf course. And, you know, you could maybe, I don't know, look at it differently. But that's just me. I don't know. It's just an idea that I had when Magnus was talking, because I know so many of my friends who are playing golf, but they drive to the golf estates. Even if they're living on a golf estate, they drive to somewhere else. So I thought to myself, you know, why live there? And I guess, I don't know, you guys know more than I, but there's a cost that comes with having a golf estate, and you've got to have that upkeep of it. So people who don't play golf may not always want to be part of that. That's all I'm saying.
Thanks, Mike. And I'm going to give Magnus a chance to finish. But what I don't hear is that the ranking of my golf course, or let's say amenities, directly impacts or increases my property value. If I can put it around about two way. Magnus?
Yeah, I would agree with that, Johan. I think that's not very important. As I said, in the early days, everybody wanted to have a championship golf course and be the #1. And maybe you have a PGA tournament there every 5 years. And you spend so much money, and it just didn't translate into higher property values in my view. And I think the guys have walked away from it and saying, come on, guys, the costs are too high, because it is a cost. And you will know that the golf course can be a drain on a lot of homeowners. In fact, in some of the bigger estates, less than 50% of people play golf. They like living on the golf course because it's manicured and pretty, but they don't play the game. And that has become something of a problem with certain estates. So, you know, as I'm saying, that doesn't, people would, the husband who's a golfer might say, darling, I'm buying a house in the #1 golf course in the country. And darling will look at him and saying, but how many bathrooms and how many bedrooms and how many kitchens, etc. She will look at the real stuff. Yeah, and that will be the determining factor.
Yeah. If we look at estates, we're talking about estates and investment. You know, I think it's also important that we look a little bit outside South Africa. Mauritius, Botswana, Namibia, Mozambique. Any stats or any experience there? Magnus, I know you, when you've said it, you own property in Mauritius. You know, what's your sort of take on not just Mauritius, but the other SADC countries in and around South Africa?
Well, you know, starting with Mozambique, I know that a lot of people have bought there, but there's an issue about property ownership and the law and transfer of property. So that is a big risk for people in Mozambique. Namibia or Botswana, there's very little interest in Botswana, but Namibia, there's a lot of people moving to Brenthurst and Namibia on a smaller scale. I have had more experience in Mauritius, where there is something of a property rush. I'm currently in Mauritius, and the South Africans are pouring in here at an unprecedented rate, and they're just buying up mainly to get residency here, and also to buy before they think the prices will go up, because there is a scarcity of land. So of those areas that you've mentioned, Johan, Mauritius is by far the dominant from a South African perspective. You cannot get onto a plane to Mauritius right now for the next 2 months. I'm living in a place called La Balise, which is just sold out now up in the north, and they're not cheap. But the South Africans are looking at Mauritius as a plan B, tax reasons, safety reasons, and also simply to invest in property, which I think in the long term will do extremely well, because you can still get places very close to the coast at reasonable prices after COVID. That won't last long. But at the moment, Mauritius is the property hotspot. And you can see it in the adverts. Pam Golding, Rawson's, Sotheby's, Park Lane, everybody's on the island and marketing properties. They don't call it the Boere Monaco for nothing here where I'm living. We speak more Afrikaans here in Mauritius than we do in Peakenwood.
That's unbelievable. Well, it's from our point of view, it's an opportunity, for our members to maybe find employment there, or to grow, businesses related to estates, from management to not maybe necessarily security, but the management or the levy collections and so forth.
Very much so. We've set up a business doing exactly that, Johan, and we are incredibly busy talking to doctors, setting up practices, yacht builders, property developers, construction, macadamia nuts. You can't believe how many South Africans are here looking at opportunities, considering what's happening in South Africa at the moment.
We almost done. I'm looking at the time. I've got a question for each of you that I want to close off. But before I ask the last question, I know it's slightly off the point, but I said I'm going to ask you social media. You're both very active on Twitter. I see you Magnus, you've got something like 45,000 followers, and Mike 25,000 followers. Just give us, in your world, you sit on the other side. I see sometimes you get hammered, sometimes you get good response, sometimes negative. Share with us your experience, and then I'm going to end off with a question for each of you in terms of property investments. But I'd like your take on social media.
I only started playing the social media game about 3 years ago, and I was blown away by the power of social media. I always wonder why my kids are always on Twitter or on Facebook and on all those other goeters that they do. Now I know it is absolutely incredibly powerful. Today, in the old days, I used to wake up and go and fetch the newspaper and go and read what was written 10 hours ago by someone. I wake up in the morning today, I switch on Twitter, I see what's trending, and if I like something, I would go and follow it further. So as a news service, as a gossip service, as a commentary service, Twitter and all those things are absolutely incredibly powerful, fun, sometimes not so much fun. I might have 45,000, I've got 44,000 followers and only 1,000 to like me, but they read what you write. And it's a very powerful marketing tool. It's very, very powerful in my opinion.
Thanks, Marcus. Mike?
Yeah, I also agree that it's a very powerful marketing tool, social media. I've no doubt I get a lot of business through my LinkedIn, I think. Okay. I sometimes publish a bit of research, or I get a bit of clicks through that as well for my clients. Twitter, obviously, and Facebook as well. I agree with Magnus. Twitter is a very nice place to find what's happening now. If you want a bit more business thoughts and so on, there are groups that you can join on LinkedIn. So if you are into properties and so on, you could probably join a nice group there And, the information will roll forward. It might be a bit more commercialized or commercial information, but it's also good. I wouldn't underestimate it. My thinking is the world is changing. I just don't know how much time we're going to end up spending on the social media, because that's the one thing it destroys, is our time to be productive. And then people do pull you into arguments, and you need to get out of that as quickly as possible as well. But yeah, and I think it's not a good place though to measure political polls, because there'll be somebody who pays people to put their name all over the place, and to be the stormtroopers, if you wish, so you've got to ignore a lot of that sort of stuff. But where it's important, I think, in economic terms, is you get somebody will quickly put up something in South Africa is downgraded, because they're journalists and they're people that are waiting for, say, Moody's to do something. And then they want to tell everybody that we found this, this is what they've done. And so without you having to watch the website of Moody's, Twitter is very, very good in that. A bit more of the latest research in a little bit of off-beaten track stuff, like, I don't know, let's just call it fiscal or monetary policy or something. You could find some very interesting stuff on the economic LinkedIn pages. There's people that do really good work. So I think it's definitely part of our lives. It does take a lot of time, and you do get pulled into things, and you have to be very careful. You mustn't just hit out at people as well, because it's very easy to do, and you'll find yourself in quite a lot of trouble if you're not careful. I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Mike. So if I had R1 million 20 years ago, in hindsight, both gentlemen, where would I, in terms of property, let's narrow down to estates or property, where would the best investment be if I bought something 20 years ago, let's say for R1 million? And where's the best place to buy today if I want good returns in 20 years from now?
Well, Johan, probably the Western Cape would have been the best place to be. Steenberg was, okay, because of the scarcity of land in the Western Cape. Steenberg was by far, because it's the only two Gulf estates in the Cape. One is Steenberg, and the other one is the Atlantic, whatever they call it. And but Steenberg by far the best. And the Western Cape had that rush of people towards the Western Cape. Where will I do it now? Probably still somewhere in the Western Cape, maybe maybe towards the Paarl. I think the Paarl, I've mentioned it earlier. One of those estates, not necessarily Valdevie, but Boshenmeer, and some of the estates being built there. I would still look in the Western Cape for a variety of reasons, and we know why. Better managed, the roads are clean, people are safe, and there is a stream of young people moving towards the Western Cape. So it'll still be the Western Cape as far as I'm concerned.
Okay, Magnus, thank you. Mike?
I'm not a particularly good person with estates, so I'll say I agree with Magnus on the Western Cape for the last 20 years. I didn't even know about Steenberg, to be honest. I know about Dainfern, and I know about all the other things, and here in Waterval and everywhere people put down. But I would agree with the Western Cape. I would think for the next while, there might be a little bit of a change in scenario where people would look at other options in the Western Cape. I think George is not a bad option in the sense of there's an airport or around there. Maybe not George necessarily, but you know what I mean. That sort of southeastern part of the Western Cape. Certainly, that will be one place I would enjoy. And I agree with Magnus on one thing. I don't want to buy something that I don't want to live in. And
very good principle.
And I think I would love to go down that way to a George or the Western Cape over time. I have no doubt about that. I think the other thing is that where the cities are still growing, I think, in most cases, I think our rural towns and dorpies and, anything from Rustenburg down are struggling. The ratepayers aren't there. The municipalities can't fix things. Whereas in the metro areas and the larger towns like Mbombela, you'll find that there's still enough services and things. I don't always know all the boundaries of the towns, but I can tell you now, I would much rather in certain not much rather live there, right? But I'd feel less inclined to worry in living in a big metro, because I know there's a lot of people there that can sort out the electricity or the water problems, whereas in the smaller areas, they've run dry. I mean, when I hear these horror stories of Lichtenberg, and I hear my friends at Astral Foods, the stories that they went through, you know, I really feel for them. I mean, it's a crisis. I have people phoning me from Modimolle and from Harry Smith and whatever. It's chaos out there, and I mean real chaos. And you know, that's where you don't want to be. And I think that's also important to say, that's probably in most cases you might have a Clarence where you can go to, or you might have, I know exactly where Prince Albert is, but people have raved about it before. I'm just thinking logically. So yes, there will be exceptions, but in the general, I would rather be in a Stellenbosch, a Parel, a George, than I'd like to be in because it's in the Western Cape, and I'd rather be otherwise in the metros, in the big city areas, because I think there's backup there. There's nothing else I can add to that. Just one little aside, if I may. I quickly had a look for African house prices. So far, I've only found Namibia, but you know, and you'll find that the average house price in Namibia, for some other reason, went up 15%. But in Windhoek, they are only up 5%. And that's over the last year. And in Swakopmund, which is the other one I chose, they are down 15%.
Wow.
So that's the only thing I can say. I just wanted to add that. That's just in the last year. It's not a comprehensive research. It was just when Magnus was talking about Mauritius, I was trying to look up other African house prices.
So guys, we got to the end of an hour. I'd like to thank Magnus. We've come a long way, and Mike, meeting you today, thank you very much. Really got the Springbok team, and hopefully they can perform on Saturday like we performed today, or you two. Thank you very much. For anybody who wants to reach out to Mike or to Magnus, they're with Brenthurst Wealth, and if you want contact numbers, you're welcome to reach out to me. I'll put you in contact with him. Thank you for the time, and I'm going to give Mike a few seconds to close and Magnus to say the last word, seeing that he sits in Mauritius and we all here in South Africa in load shedding. Mike?
I will just say this. I think the world's got a debt problem on the one side. I don't think interest rates are going to go up much around the world, and that'll influence us. But I want to get to South Africa, where I'm very, I understand our economy well. We are at the crossroads. We are probably closer to the end of the crossroads than we realize. And if these things like the meeting we had with Eskom management and yesterday, you know, it dawns on me that our politicians always talk big, but when the crap hits the fan, they're nowhere to be found. And quite frankly, even the Western Cape will be impacted. The Western Cape is, you know, my doctor said to me the other day, the Western Cape is just the top deck of the Titanic. Now, before you think I'm just, so that doesn't mean that everybody falls down, but this is not the time in a property sense, in this economy, to put all your money down into just South African property. And if you do put it down just in South African property, I would agree partly with Magnus. You want to put it down in the Western Cape, maybe one or two bigger metros, but I would start also looking at how do I divest myself from only having, say, major property developments in South Africa. Right now, we are at the crossroads. Doesn't mean I'm going to be wrong. we can still make it. There's no doubt. I still have a lot of hope. Let me put it that way. But really, I'm not seeing the politicians really step up, have a proper idea. It's harping on about old slogans. Old slogans are not going to get us anywhere. And that is my concern. And this whole thing that it becomes racial the whole time, very often I feel, you know, you're hitting out at the wrong people. And when you talk about the rich in South Africa, you're actually talking about taxpayers from 6,700 Rand up. The average person in South Africa on the formal sector side would be a lower middle class in America. Now, if you go to America and you say to the lower middle class, I want to give you a 40% tax rate, you know, you're going to have a rebellion. And in a sense, our rebellion can't really happen because it's not that many. It's about 7 million people pay income tax. 2 million of them are working for the state. So the 5 million private sector taxpayers are carrying a heavy burden here.
Yeah.
And, you know, I'm saying this now because we've got the medium-term budget policy statement tomorrow, and we're busy we're going to write something later for Magnus then, but we have to write articles for the newspapers and stuff. So I'm looking at this and I'm just thinking, my God, don't these oaks understand the money has run out? The tin is at the end of the fucking road and you've already stepped on it. It's squashed. There isn't no more kicking allowed. You're going to be kicking air. And you're going to, the horse is dead. There's no more blood to bleed from it. And that is where we are. And if we don't turn this quickly in the next year or two, I would really suggest you downgrade your portfolio of property in South Africa. Maybe you can upgrade it into a different area in South Africa, like the Western Cape, or maybe a Dane firm, but there's going to be far less areas to invest in, even in the property arena, because a lot more dorpies and places are going to have problems, and even maybe one or two of the bigger metros. I don't know how the finances looks in each and every one of them, but Tshwane has got huge problems. The debt owed by consumers in bad debt is, you know, up something like 250% in a year, in a decade. It's not going to go down, and it's already about 5% of GDP on its own. So at some stage, even the stronger municipalities are going to have very, very big problems. So I think that if I talk to property investors, maybe not what you want to hear. If you've already invested enough, I think you need to you need to invest in places and estates. I've heard of this where a lot of the stuff is run by that estate, run. They have their own contract with Eskom. They don't go through a town. All that may be where the future lies. I don't know, but it's not going to be business as usual. And sorry for that bad news.
It's not bad news. It's a reality. Thanks, Mike. And I mean, you are the authority when it comes to these things. So thank you. Thank you for the honesty. Magnus from sunny Mauritius.
You know, very briefly on, I've been telling people for many years, 10 to 15 years, if you want to live in South Africa, make sure you live in an estate. And in order to be able to afford to live in an estate, you need to invest your money offshore. And that has been a perfect recipe. Your offshore returns have done double, if not treble, the local stock market. But your lifestyle in South Africa has been phenomenal and much, much cheaper than you can buy in most parts of the world. But you have to have the one and the other. You can't have one without the other. So make sure you live in a good, well-run estate in beautiful, sunny South Africa. But make sure you have an offshore portfolio to ensure that you can continue living on that estate. That's all from me, Johan, and thank you for the seminar. I have to run, and cheers to everybody, and cheers to Mike.
Thank you. Thanks, guys. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. That's the end of the webinar. You feel free to leave the chat whenever you're ready. Thank you so much.